Let's deep dive the starting pitching market. All today on Locked On Tigers.
You are Locked On Tigers, your daily Detroit Tigers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Locked On Tigers. I'm, of course, your host, Scott Bentley. Today is Wednesday, November 27th, 2024. Thank you so much for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place just a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Welcome in, welcome all, everybody. Happy Wednesday, Thanksgiving Eve. Today, we are going to discuss the starting pitching market. We have talked about the Tigers' need to add starting pitching at length this offseason. That is not a surprise. That's not a new opinion or fact, really. It's not a new stance to have. And we've talked about that a lot already, but we haven't done really a huge deep dive on all the starting pitchers that will be available in the free agency pool and just available period this offseason. I think now that the non-tender deadline has passed, we really know the full scope of pitching. And it's not just starting pitching either. This team needs to add some bullpen and reliever help, and we'll talk about that today as well. I think whenever you have a conversation about what you want to bring in, you have to start off with what you have. And I think that is where you see there's a decent amount of depth in the starting rotation and in the bullpen for that matter. There's a decent amount of pitching depth here, but there isn't a lot of certified starters either. For instance, you are going into next year, the only two guys that I think are really guaranteed a spot in the starting rotation are Tarek Skubal and Reese Olson. Everybody else, varying, possibility percentages, right? Like different varying likelihoods for each. I'm not saying everybody else is all necessarily in the same, in the same camp or anything, but I do think that there's only two that are at 100, and that is Reese Olson and Tarek Skubal. That being said, there are depth arms that if you need to make a start, or just guys that will be in battle for that fifth spot in the rotation. Matt Manning, for instance, obviously had his troubles this year, had some injury stuff at the end of the season, but even when he was healthy, was not pitching in the majors very much at all this season. Jackson Jobe is going to be in the mix, was on the playoff roster pitched a playoff inning or one or two playoff innings for the Detroit Tigers this year. He is certainly going to be in the mix for a rotation spot. Ty Madden got work in the second half and down the stretch of last season. Cater Montero got a lot of work this past year, was one of the only healthy starting pitchers this team had down the stretch. He'll be in the mix in spring training. Casey Mize, obviously, is going to be in that competition, in that mix, and is going to have a chance to be, honestly, he'll be in the mix for that fifth rotation spot. But none of those guys do we sit here on November 27th and go, this dude needs to be in the starting rotation no matter what. They don't need to upgrade. They don't need to go out and get any more arms. These guys, anybody that I just listed, these have to be in the rotation. I don't think any of those fall into that category for me personally. And as far as the bullpen goes, I'm not worried about bullpen depth at this point. This coaching staff has done such a phenomenal job developing pitching talent over the last few years and in the Fetter, Lund, Nieves, Hinch era. that like I'm pretty convinced that they are going to be able to call up dang near anybody in the middle of the season, and they're going to provide valuable innings for the team and be utilized in the correct way. Like I really don't have worries about the trickle down effect and going down and like, oh, do we have any relievers in AAA? Like, yeah, we're fine. I have full faith in our development system at this point as far as that goes. But the top end relievers is oddly what's missing here. And that's usually not how bullpens are built. Most bullpens are built around one guy or two guys, right? I mean, you look at Cleveland, even for instance. They've built a phenomenal bullpen, but it starts and ends with Class A's performance. This Tigers team did the opposite of the contrary. They did the contrary. They did the opposite of what is popular there. They have a lot of really solid, and this is something we talked about. I remember talking about this on this show back in spring training of 2024 and talking about, well, I'm not sure they have like a high-end, high leverage reliever, but they have a lot of, innings 5 through 7 type of guys that'll be pretty good. And I think that that's held true. So they need to go out and get a high-end strikeout, swing and miss, really, really good high-end reliever. We'll take a look at that market today as well. When looking at the starting pitching market, I think we should start with the top-end big-name guys. So that's Corbin Burnes, Blake Snell, and honestly, we can throw Sasaki in there too. Sasaki's a little bit different. He is being listed as an international free agent, so his is not going to be just like a bidding war where a bunch of teams are just going to, like Yamamoto was last year, where the price tag just kept going up and up and up and higher, and then, eventually he signed for $300 million with the Dodgers. Sasaki's an international free agent, which uses international pool money. So it's a limited contract. Everybody's going to give him around the same amount of money because there's a cap on how much international free agents can get paid. So he's truly going to go to just the place he wants to go to and thinks is the best fit long term. So there's not too much else of a conversation there. I think the Dodgers are pretty clearly the clubhouse favorites there, but there have been a lot of reports about, it's not just the Dodgers and nobody else. There's a lot more of a fluidity to his negotiations and his visits and whatnot, and that other teams are in there. There was even an article by MLB.com that had the Tigers as like an under the radar. I'll believe it when I see it. I'm not going to get my hopes up about that. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not going to tell you that I think that that's going to happen and that you should hold out hope for Sasaki to be a Tiger, but that one is really like balls in his court. There's no, like bidding war. Oh, Illich is a cheapskate, whatever. That's just like, this is just pretty much where he wants to go is where he's going to end up. The rest of them, while still where they want to go is where they'll end up, do have obviously plenty of financial incentives to go to certain places, and there will be bidding wars for all of them. So Burnes and Snell, look, if there was a notification that I got on Thanksgiving that said, hey, the Tigers are signing Corbin Burnes to a, 5-7 year, 200 whatever million, I would jump for joy. And we would come on here and celebrate, and we would be absolutely thrilled about it. Do I expect the Tigers to be players in either the Burnes or the Snell market? No. And the reason why is not because they would not be fantastic additions and you wouldn't create one of the best 1-2 punches in baseball with Skubal and either of these two guys. The reason why is because I think Scott Harris is given a budget. I think ownership is telling Harris, and obviously he'll never say this out loud, but I think ownership is telling him you have X amount of dollars you can spend this offseason. And when the Tigers look at their team needs, and they look at what they want to address in the winter and who they want to sign and what positional groups they want to sign, very, very, very low priority when compared to the other positions that they still have team needs in is an elite high-end starting pitcher. They have one of those. And that doesn't mean that you can't have more than one. Plenty of teams do. But when it comes to how to use your budget, how to use the amount of money you have set aside, I think that they will probably utilize those resources in middle to lower end starting pitchers and bats that can help, as opposed to high end starting pitchers. Now, this is not me going to bat, no pun intended, for ownership, because I know that ownership can, if they really wanted to, afford Burns and still go sign bats, and it wouldn't be anything to this ownership group. But I also understand how this works, and how the business side and how this game operates. And I don't see the Tigers being huge players in a high level, because then, like, what if that's all the money you have to spend for this offseason, right? What if the budget is completely blown through on one player, and it's a high end starting pitcher, and now we're rolling into next season with a better rotation, certainly, but the same offense, and the pitching wasn't the problem last year. So they need to fill out the rotation. They need to address starting pitching. We will talk a lot about some of the viable candidates here, but in terms of Burns and Snell, not because I'm happy about it, I'm not expecting the Tigers to be too big of players in that market. Let's talk about players who they might actually be in the market for, and we'll do that right after this. Got to talk to you today about our friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place all of your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Segment 2 of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in, as always, making us your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow. We will, in fact, be back tomorrow for Thanksgiving. Just going to have a really lighthearted Thanksgiving-themed episode, stuff like that. Nothing too serious unless some crazy thing. Actually, even if a crazy moves happen, I'm going up north with my family for Thanksgiving. So you're getting the Thanksgiving episode tomorrow, whether we trade the entire team away or not. But I can't imagine it's going to be too terribly busy over the holiday. Famous last words. We'll see what happens. Today, though, we are talking about starting pitching and the additions the Tigers could make to their rotations. We have 2 guaranteed starters internally. Then we have a lot of guys that could be playing for a job but aren't guarantees to make the rotation. So who's out there to add, and how many starting pitchers do you want to add? I think 2 is a really good number. I think you have enough depth where the rest of the players that aren't given a spot automatically going into spring training can compete and fight for that spot. The depth is still young enough in their career where they can go to Toledo, and then when injuries inevitably happen, you can call up any of those guys that don't make the team out of camp. I think if you sign nobody, you're cutting it way too thin. You're then at that point you're talking about of the names I just mentioned, 4 or 5 starting pitchers I just mentioned, 3 of those guys would be in the rotation on opening day, and you're 2 injuries away from right back to having 0 starting pitchers again outside of your rotation, and that's not a place you want to be, as we found out very quickly in 2024. Now, I say a place you don't want to be. Obviously, the pitching chaos thing worked, but as the organization has stated, I completely agree with them. That is not a sustainable thing over 162. You need innings, and you can't tax your bullpen as much as the Tigers did in the last 2 months of the season throughout an entire 162 throughout an entire summer. So who's out there? Obviously, Jack Flaherty is a conversation a lot of people want to have because he was so good as a Tiger. I would imagine his market is a lot bigger than it was last season. Last season, he was coming off a terrible year where he got traded to the Orioles and was just not very good. Went to the Tigers, was fantastic. The Tigers got obviously a pretty solid return, as we are finding out, for him from the Dodgers at the deadline. And now he's a free agent again. And I would imagine he wants multiple years. The thing with Flaherty, he is still not 30 years old. He is still under the age of 30. 29 years old and just put together probably the second best season of his career outside of the year where he was a finalist for Cy Young. One of the best seasons of his young career. So I think that he'll probably be looking for a long-term deal. I think he'll probably get a solid 3 to 5 year deal. And I would imagine the Tigers will kick the tires on Jack Flaherty. Do I think that Flaherty's going to come back? No. And the reason why has nothing to do with Flaherty individually and nothing to do with the Tigers' lack of an interest in Flaherty. It's pretty much just as simple as, when was the last time you saw someone get traded from a team at the deadline and then sign back with that team? It's like the coping mechanism that every single fan base in every sport, every trade deadline tells themselves when they trade a player away. It's like, okay, we'll just sign him back in the offseason. It never happens. I can think of on one hand the amount of times that has happened in the last decade. I guess Aroldis Chapman did it with the Yankees. There's a couple other examples, I guess, but those are so few and far between. And there is going to be such an open market. And heck, he pitched so well, he might even get borderline ace money. I'm not saying he's going to get paid, what Blake Snell or certainly what Corbin Burns get paid. I'm not saying he's going to be a $200 million dollar contract, but I mean, he might get top end of the rotation money. And I'm not sure the Tigers want to invest that on him. But on the flip side, he's one of the youngest starting pitchers on the entire market. And that's what the Tigers are looking for, is youth and players that they can rack up for multiple years. So we'll see what happens. I'm not holding my breath on it, but that's certainly an avenue that some people want to go. Nathan Eovaldi, another player in a similar tier, I would say, as Jack Flaherty. Eovaldi's 35 years old this upcoming season. He's 34 right now. Had a pretty solid year. The thing with, I love Nasty Nate. He is one of my favorite pitchers to watch, and I think is one of the more underrated pitchers of the last 5 to 7 years. The issue with Nate is he gets hurt a lot, and now he's going to be 35, and I'm not sure. Look, if this is another one where if it was announced that the Tigers signed Eovaldi, I'd be over the moon. I would be thrilled, because I firmly believe that there might not be a pitching coaching staff that can get the most out of Eovaldi in baseball, right? I mean, the Red Sox, he was good. If he goes to the Dodgers, certainly. The Rays, they won't pay him though. You know what I mean? The Tigers are on a short list of teams that I think would make Eovaldi truly incredible. But there's a concern with injuries, and I'm not sure the investment money-wise is worth the injury concern at this point in his career either. So kind of a give and take, but I would be very easily convinced that this is an awesome move if the Tigers were to bring him in at the same time. Kyle Gibson, not really interested in, more of a pitch to contact guy, starting to push 40 years old. Nick Pivetta is a very interesting conversation here. I think you could probably get Nick Pivetta on a 1 to 3 year deal, somewhere in there. I would imagine he'll want multiple years. He's only 32, so on the younger side of a free agent market, but had a pretty solid year this year. Declined the qualifying offer, though. And Nick Pivetta is kind of in between. Most players that are good enough to decline a qualifying offer, you look at and you go, okay, if I lose a second round pick because of this, it's still so worth it. Pivetta is, again, had a really solid season. I would probably still pretty easily give up a second round pick, especially where the Tigers are going to be picking this year, for a bona fide starting pitcher, but not on a 1 year deal, certainly. And if it would have to be a good team-friendly contract for me to just be willing to get rid of a second-round pick potentially for a player of Pavetta's caliber. But at the end of the day, that trade-off is almost always worth it. What's best case scenario for a second-round pick? Probably a guy that's good enough to decline a qualifying offer in 6 years. So if you can get that now, I would take it, but I wouldn't overpay him. And I'm certainly not giving up a second-round pick and losing a second-round pick for a guy that's only going to be here for a year. So that would have to be a multi-year deal. Sean Manaea, very similar conversation, also declined his qualifying offer at a very similar year to Pivetta as far as WAR goes. I think that's a pretty fair and similar conversation with him too. Manaea is an interesting one because he moved around. I mean, he was in the bullpen at one point in 2023, came back, had a really solid year for the Mets this season, though. Has kind of a funky arm slot, can get lefties pretty well. That would be a guy that I think would work really, really well with the Tigers pitching coaching staff as well. Let's get into, I think, the conversation that most people are kind of itching to have. Let's talk Justin Verlander, and then we'll talk about some of the lower end starting pitching options out there and the bullpen as well. We'll do that right after this. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Third and final segment of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate you all for tuning in. As always, must see JV, baby. He is 42 years old. How time flies, man. I can remember his debut. I remember watching his major league debut, and I remember my parents having to explain to me why it was such a big deal that he was making his major league debut. Because I was 7 or 8 years old. And then he was on my baseball team all the way through graduating high school. He got traded while I was in college. It's crazy. The passage of time is certainly wild. Verlander, now 42, did not have a great season this year. Had an ERA over 5. Also dealt with some injury stuff. Made fewer than 20 starts, which, as all of us know, following Justin Verlander over the years, Justin Verlander not giving you innings is a rarity. And that is something that he has been an absolute workhorse for his entire career. Would I be okay with a Verlander reunion? Yes, I would. I would be okay with it as long as it was a one-year deal and it was cheap. I am not giving Justin Verlander multiple years after an ERA over 5 season at 42 years old and coming off of multiple injuries over the last 4 years. Love the dude to death. Gonna be, one of my childhood heroes forever. Got to separate emotion from logistics here. The only situation in which I would bring Verlander back is if it was a cheap one-year deal. And I'm not sure what his market is, really. I don't know if teams have a ton of interest in Verlander. I don't know if everybody is only kind of looking at a cheap one-year deal. I'm not sure. I think the furthest I would go is 1 year and then a team option for like a second year. But even that, like you're still in control. You can still make it a one-year deal if he struggles. His stats have gradually gone down each of the last 3 seasons. 2022, he was phenomenal. Sub-2 ERA, Cy Young candidate, fantastic. 2023, he was solid, but definitely was not as good as he was. Still was fine, though. Was still a really good starting pitcher. And then this year, it kind of all blew up. And the biggest reason why is his fastball. The velocity has just deteriorated. This is a guy that consistently was, pumping 97 or 100 when, in the 7th inning when he was in his prime. And no one, he hasn't been in his prime in a while. No one's expecting that. But even over the last 3 years, his age 40 season, he was averaging 95 miles an hour on his fastball year. Still, this past season, he averaged under 93 and a half. So it's a risk. And I know that people are emotionally attached to him, and I get it. And if you can get him on a cheap one-year deal and you can have him be the 4th or 5th starter, I think that this pitching coaching staff can probably maximize his usage and get the most out of him. But I'm not going to be heartbroken if Verlander ends up going elsewhere, especially if somebody gives him a decent paycheck to do so. But if it happens, we'll come on here and I'm sure it'll be a positive episode if it is to happen. Some of the other guys we talked about, Patrick Sandoval yesterday, Andrew Heaney, no thank you. I mean, I can see the appeal for the Tigers because, hey, big stadium and you're a fly ball pitcher that gives up a lot of homers. You'd give up less here. I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Shane Bieber coming off of an injury, kind of an interesting one. Max Scherzer, if you want to reminisce as well, also 40 years old and his velocity has fallen down. And then like Michael Lorenzen, another old friend. Mike Clevenger, no thank you. Alex Cobb, maybe. Griffin Canning, no thank you. Lance Lynn, no thank you. Matthew Boyd, I don't need a part 3 on that as much as I love the dude. Jose Quintana, maybe. Clayton Kershaw, never going to happen. Kyle Hendricks, no. I guess he just signed with the Angels, so that's kind of a moot point. Luis Severino is an interesting one. Declined a qualifying offer. I think we'll end the starting pitching conversation on him, even though there's plenty more options out there. But Severino has really good stuff, has pretty solid velocity, and I think, again, declined the qualifying offer, so I would only do it on a multi-year deal, which I guess then plays into a little bit of risk. A couple years ago, he had a terrible year. He had some injury stuff. A little bit of a bounce back season this year. Clearly thinks he can get multiple years on the market because he did decline the QO. And I think that Severino's a guy I wanted the Tigers to go after last year. And there actually was reports from Petzold and other beat writers that the Tigers were interested in Severino. That's a matchup that I would really like. I think that we could really maximize his stuff and kind of get him back on track to what people thought he was going to be when he was a young New York Yankee. Frankie Montas, similar conversation, I think, there as well. Bullpen. There's a billion relievers. We're not going to go through relievers, the most populous position in baseball. So I'm not going to go through all 600 relievers that are available. If you have a guy in mind that you think can get swings and misses, there's a pretty good chance that he'd be a good fit for the Tigers. The one for me is Jeff Hoffman. And I understand that would probably cost you a pretty penny. And some people are very anti-paying big contracts to relievers. I totally get it. I really do. Let this be the exception. Okay. This dude gets swings and misses and gets strikeouts like crazy. And this past year, he had an ERA just barely over 2. Sign him to 2 or 3 years. I don't even need him to have that low of an ERA. I don't need him to be like, oh, we're going out and getting our bona fide closer. If he can just be a righty that you can put in and can get a strikeout when you need a swing and miss. That was the one thing this bullpen struggled with. Every other aspect they were fantastic in. They didn't have a bona fide swing and miss guy that they could pull out and bring out of the pen with runners on base late in a ball game. We'd have to go to Foley, and you were like, okay, well, I'm going to hold my breath now because the ball's getting put in play. There's going to be a ground ball somewhere, and if it's a seeing eye single, then you're going to lose the game. They need a high leverage strike thrower that gets whiffs. Jeff Hoffman is that, and that is a guy that I would really, really like the Tigers to go after. But people are always going to bring up Chapman, David Robertson at 40, still slinging it. Tanner Scott had a really solid year this year. Clay Holmes, really rocky season, but is going to be available. Kenley Jansen, I think, is the active leader in saves. Oh, it might still be Craig Kimbrell. Top 2 in active saves leaders, but is now also pushing 40. Chris Martin had a really good year 2 years ago, also pushing 40. Sean Armstrong, Hobie Milner, no thanks. And then you start getting into Caleb Ferguson, I guess, maybe AJ Minter. There is Craig Kimbrell. Buck Farmer. Let's just have a reunion for everybody. Scott Barlow. Man, Scott Barlow. I remember when he was supposed to be a really good starter. Yeah. So, Andrew Chafin again, he's kind of fallen off a little bit. Again, there's a billion relievers. I'm not just going to read through the entire list here. It would take us all day. But I really want the Tigers to at least be aggressive in potentially getting Jeff Hoffman. That'd be really cool to me. Thanks for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow as we celebrate Thanksgiving here in the States. To our Canadian listeners, we appreciate you all, and you can celebrate with us here. All right. Peace and love. Going to therapy's dope. I'll catch y'all tomorrow, baby. Go Tigers.